The morning sun cast long shadows over Camp Pendleton's training grounds. Lieutenant Emma Hayes stood at the edge of the firing range, the weight of her M24 sniper rifle familiar in her hands. At 29, she was smaller than most of the recruits around her, standing just 5'4", with a slender, athletic build that made her look more like a college track star than someone who had already served with distinction in Afghanistan. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her brown eyes scanning the targets downrange with practiced focus. The California heat pressed down on the concrete training area, but Emma barely noticed it. She had endured far worse during her tours overseas. This was day one of the Advanced Military Arts Program, an intensive course designed to develop elite combat specialists in the post-9/11 military landscape. Emma was one of only 3 women in a group of 35 participants, and she could already feel the sideways glances and whispered comments from some of the men. She loaded her rifle with mechanical precision, her movements economical and practiced. The firing range fell silent as she took her position. Master Sergeant Williams, the primary instructor, stood several yards behind her with a stopwatch. "When ready, Lieutenant," he said. Emma took a deep breath, settled her heart rate, and began. The rifle cracked 17 times in rapid succession, each shot finding its target with devastating accuracy. Distances varied from 400 to 800 yards, moving from left to right across the range. Captain Richard Miller, a Gulf War veteran serving as assistant instructor, checked his watch and shook his head in disbelief. 4 minutes, 12 seconds, he announced. "She just broke my record by 43 seconds. Williams reviewed the targets through his spotting scope. 17 hits, 17 targets. Clean shots, all center mass or head. He turned to the gathered participants. "That, ladies and gentlemen, is what we're looking for in this program." Emma shouldered her rifle and stepped back from the firing line, ignoring the mix of impressed and skeptical looks from the other trainees. This wasn't her first experience with doubt, and she knew it wouldn't be her last. The daughter of Colonel James Hayes, a decorated Delta Force operator who had served with distinction in the Gulf War, Emma had military service in her blood. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was just 8 years old, but it was her maternal grandmother who had given her the gifts that truly set her apart. Gabriela Santos had immigrated to the United States from the Philippines after World War II, bringing with her the ancient fighting traditions of Kali and Eskrima. These were not the flashy techniques seen in martial arts movies, but practical, efficient combat methods developed over centuries of warfare in the Philippine Islands. Few people knew that Emma had been training in these arts since she was 6 years old. Every afternoon after school, while other kids played video games or watched television, Emma would spend hours in her grandmother's backyard learning footwork, stick fighting, and empty hand techniques. Gabriella was a tough teacher, demanding perfect form and endless repetition. She would make Emma practice the same movement hundreds of times until it became as natural as breathing. "In real fighting, you don't get second chances," Gabriella would say in her accented English. "The person who moves first, moves fastest, and moves smartest is the one who goes home alive." What made these lessons even more significant was the history behind them. Gabriella's father had been a member of the Hukbalahap guerrilla forces that fought against Japanese occupiers during World War II. The family had a long tradition of warriors, but they kept this heritage quiet in their American life. After graduating from West Point in 1996 with honors, Emma had surprised no one by following her father's footsteps into military service. Basic training had been challenging, but manageable thanks to her years of preparation. When the attacks of September 11th occurred, Emma was among the first wave of troops deployed to Afghanistan in Operation Enduring Freedom. It was there that she had first put her grandmother's teachings to use in actual combat, though the details of that incident remain classified. What was known was that Emma had saved her entire squad during a Taliban ambush, but the specific methods she employed had been redacted from official reports. Now, as she stood on the training grounds of Camp Pendleton, Emma had volunteered for this advanced program. She wanted to learn more to test herself against the best the military had to offer. The Advanced Military Arts Program was legendary for its intensity and effectiveness. Only the most dedicated and skilled personnel were accepted. Master Sergeant William Iron Bill Davis called the group to attention. He was a massive man standing 6'3" with shoulders like granite slabs. The scars on his face and hands told stories of battles across 3 decades, from Panama to Somalia to Afghanistan. His steel gray eyes evaluated each trainee with the cold precision of a combat veteran who had seen it all. Listen up, Davis began, his voice carrying across the training area without needing to shout. Over the next 3 weeks, you're going to learn some of the most effective combat techniques ever developed. This isn't about looking good or showing off. This is about staying alive when someone is trying to kill you. He paced slowly along the line of recruits, taking the measure of each person. This program has a 40% dropout rate, and I'd bet half of you won't make it through the first week. We're not here to build your confidence or make you feel good about yourselves. We're here to prepare you for the realities of modern warfare in an age of counterterrorism operations where the battlefield has no clear boundaries. Davis stopped directly in front of Emma, his gaze lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. Some of you might think this program is going to be easy because you've had some training or scored well on qualifications. His eyes swept back across the group. Let me assure you it won't be. We're going to push you beyond your limits because that's what combat does. And we're going to find out who can adapt and serve me when everything goes sideways. From the corner of her eye, Emma noticed one particularly large trainee, watching her with undisguised skepticism. Captain Michael Reynolds was well known in military circles, a former Army Ranger who had seen action in Panama, Kosovo, and Afghanistan. He stood 6'2", weighed around 220 pounds of solid muscle, and carried himself with the confident swagger of a man accustomed to being the alpha in any room. Reynolds had been part of the infamous Gothic Serpent operation in Mogadishu, Somalia, the Black Hawk Down incident that had claimed the lives of 19 American soldiers. The experience had left him with both a silver star and a deep-seated belief that combat effectiveness was directly tied to physical strength and aggressive mindset. "We'll start with hand-to-hand combat fundamentals," Davis announced. "Partner up and show me what you've got. Remember, this isn't a dance. The goal is to put your opponent on the ground and keep them there." The recruits began pairing off, most choosing partners of similar size and build. Emma found herself standing alone as the groups formed around her. She wasn't surprised. In situations like this, people usually wanted to partner with someone they thought could challenge them or help them look good. Finally, Sergeant James Anderson walked over to her. He was tall and solidly built, clearly an experienced soldier, but his expression showed uncertainty about the pairing. "Guess it's you and me, Lieutenant," he said with a slight shrug. Emma nodded and gave him a professional smile. "Works for me, Sergeant." As they moved to their designated practice area, she could hear Reynolds talking to a group of Marines nearby. His voice wasn't quite low enough to be private. "This should be interesting," Reynolds said with a smirk. "Wonder how long the lieutenant will last before she calls it quits." Another Marine laughed. "My money's on 30 seconds before she taps out." Emma's jaw tightened slightly, but she said nothing. Her grandmother had taught her that words were just noise. Actions were what mattered. She had been underestimated her entire life because of her size and appearance, and she had learned to use that to her advantage. Anderson took up a fighting stance, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of sparring with a female officer. His movements were hesitant and telegraphed as he moved in for a basic takedown attempt. "Don't hold back, Sergeant," Emma said quietly. "You won't learn anything that way, and neither will I." Anderson nodded and committed more fully to his attack. Emma sidestepped smoothly, using a basic hip throw that put him on the mat with startling ease. Anderson hit the ground with a surprised grunt and looked up at her with new respect. "Where did you learn that move, Lieutenant?" he asked as she helped him to his feet. "Family tradition," she replied simply. They continued the exercise for another 10 minutes, with Emma successfully defending against most of Anderson's attacks and executing several clean takedowns of her own. Her movements were efficient and controlled, never using more force than necessary but always effective. Nearby, Reynolds was dominating his partner, a Navy SEAL, who was giving him a real challenge. Reynolds was strong and aggressive, using his size advantage to overpower his opponent. When he noticed Emma's success against Anderson, his expression darkened. "Hey, Davis," Reynolds called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "I think Hayes there needs a real challenge. Anderson's clearly going too easy on her." The training area went quiet as all eyes turned toward them. Master Sergeant Davis walked over and observed their training for a moment. "You having trouble with the exercise, Captain?" Davis asked Reynolds. "No, Sergeant," Reynolds replied with a slight smile. "But I don't think the lieutenant is getting proper training partnered with someone who's pulling his punches. Maybe she should work with someone more appropriate for her skill level." The implication was clear and insulting. Reynolds was suggesting that Emma needed to be treated with kid gloves, that she couldn't handle training with a real opponent. Several of the Marines chuckled at the comment. Anderson's face flushed red with embarrassment. Actually, Sergeant Lieutenant Hayes has been doing great, Anderson said. She's gotten me down several times already. Reynolds laughed outright. Come on, Anderson, you're just being nice because she's a woman. We all saw you pulling your punches. Emma felt her temper rising but kept her voice calm and respectful. I'm fine with my current partner, Sergeant. We're both learning. Actually, Davis said, his eyes glinting with what might have been amusement. Rotation is part of the training. Everyone needs to work with different body types and fighting styles. Hayes, you're with Thompson next round. Thompson was another Marine shorter than Reynolds, but stocky and experienced. He had been watching the exchange with interest and nodded professionally toward Emma. As they switched partners, Emma heard more comments from Reynolds and his group. This should be good, someone muttered. Thompson's not going to hold back like Anderson did, Reynolds said with satisfaction. Thompson approached Emma with a neutral expression. Ready, Lieutenant? Ready when you are, Sergeant, Emma replied. This time there was no hesitation from her partner. Thompson moved in aggressively, trying to use his weight advantage to drive Emma backward. But Emma had faced stronger opponents in her grandmother's backyard. She absorbed his initial attack, redirected his energy, and used a technique Gabriella had taught her years ago. The movement was so fast that most observers missed exactly what happened. One moment, Thompson was driving forward with all his weight behind a takedown attempt. The next moment, he was flat on his back, staring up at the California sky with a confused expression. Thompson shook his head and got back to his feet. Nice move. What was that? Just basic redirection, Emma said modestly. They continued sparring for the rest of the exercise period. Thompson was a skilled opponent who pushed Emma harder than Anderson had. But every time he thought he had figured out her patterns, she would adapt and surprise him with something new. By the end of their session, Thompson had landed exactly one successful takedown, while Emma had put him on the ground 6 times. When Davis called for a water break, Thompson walked over to Reynolds and the other Marines who had been making comments earlier. You guys might want to rethink your opinions about Hayes, Thompson said quietly. That woman knows what she's doing. Reynolds frowned. Come on, Thompson. You're telling me a 120-pound Army girl is giving you trouble? I'm telling you, she put me on my ass 6 times in 15 minutes, and I still don't know how she did half of it, Thompson replied. Her technique is unlike anything I've seen before. The other Marines looked skeptical. Reynolds in particular seemed annoyed that his narrative about Emma wasn't holding up. During the break, Emma sat apart from the main group, drinking water and reviewing the morning's training in her mind. She could hear snippets of conversation from the Marines, some of whom were now debating whether Thompson had been going easy on her too. There's no way she's that good, one of them insisted. Thompson's just being nice because she's Army and he doesn't want to cause problems. Yeah, Reynolds agreed. I bet if she went up against a real Marine in a serious match, she'd fold in 30 seconds. Anderson, who had been listening to this conversation, walked over to where Emma was sitting. Don't let them get to you, he said quietly. Some of these guys have never trained with women before. They don't know how to handle it when their assumptions get challenged. Emma looked up at him and smiled. It's fine, I'm used to it. Still, it's not right. You earned their respect this morning, whether they want to admit it or not. The afternoon session focused on weapons defense techniques. The trainees were introduced to training knives, batons, and other practice weapons designed to simulate real-world threats. In Iraq and Afghanistan, many of your close-quarter encounters will involve armed opponents, Davis explained as he demonstrated various defensive techniques. Knowing how to disarm an enemy can mean the difference between coming home in a plane seat or a pine box. Emma continued to perform well, but she noticed that several of the Marines, particularly Reynolds and his friends, were watching her more closely now. Some seemed genuinely curious about her background and training. Others appeared to be looking for any sign of weakness they could exploit. During a drill that involved defending against multiple attackers, Emma found herself surrounded by 3 larger opponents. The exercise was supposed to be controlled, focusing on movement and positioning rather than full contact. But Emma noticed that her attackers were being more aggressive than they had been with other participants. She handled the situation smoothly, using footwork and timing to avoid being overwhelmed. When one attacker got too close, she applied just enough pressure to a nerve point on his wrist to make him back off without causing real injury. By the end of the first day, word was spreading quietly through the group that the small army officer was not what she appeared to be. Some of the participants were impressed and curious. Others, particularly Reynolds and his circle of friends, seemed determined to prove that her success was just beginner's luck. As the recruits prepared to leave the training ground, Reynolds made one final comment loud enough for Emma to hear. "Don't worry, Hayes. Tomorrow we start the real training. Hope you get plenty of rest tonight because you're going to need it." That evening, Emma sat alone in her temporary quarters, her body sore from the day's exertions. She pulled out her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Lola," she said when her grandmother answered, using the Filipino term of endearment. "How are you feeling today?" "Better than yesterday, worse than tomorrow," Gabriella replied with her characteristic humor. "How was your first day of the special training?" Emma switched to a mix of Spanish and Tagalog languages she and her grandmother often used for private conversations. "Some of them don't think I belong here," she said, "especially one captain, a former ranger. He's made it his mission to prove I'm not good enough." Gabriella's weathered face showed concern even through the small phone screen. "Did you show them what you can do?" "A little. I didn't want to reveal too much on the first day." Her grandmother's eyes hardened. "Then show them what a Hayes woman is made of. But remember, child, the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. Let them underestimate you until the moment it matters most." After ending the call, Emma spent an hour meditating, focusing her mind and preparing herself for the challenges ahead. She knew that Reynolds would escalate his attempts to undermine her. Men like him couldn't tolerate having their worldview challenged, especially by someone they considered inferior. But Emma also knew something Reynolds didn't. This wasn't her first test, nor would it be her last. In Afghanistan, she had faced far worse than an arrogant captain with something to prove. The second morning dawned clear and hot. The trainees assembled on the parade ground where Master Sergeant Davis waited for them. Next to him stood a man Emma recognized immediately from her father's military photographs, Colonel Frank Martinez, one of the program's founders and a legendary Special Forces operator. "Good morning," Colonel Martinez began. "I'm here to observe today's training and evaluate the program's effectiveness. Sergeant Davis tells me we have an exceptional group this cycle." His eyes moved across the assembled trainees, lingering briefly on Emma. There was no recognition in his gaze, but something in his expression suggested interest. "Today's focus will be on advanced defensive techniques," Davis announced. "We'll be working with training knives and batons. The goal is to learn how to neutralize an armed opponent without sustaining injury yourself." The group was divided into pairs for the first exercise. Emma wasn't surprised when she found herself paired with Reynolds. "Looks like it's you and me, Lieutenant," Reynolds said with a cold smile. "Hope you're ready." Emma said he met his gaze evenly. "As you always, Captain." Davis demonstrated the proper technique for disarming an opponent with a knife, emphasizing control and positioning rather than strength. "Remember, this is controlled training," he warned as he handed out rubber training knives. "The goal is to learn the technique, not prove anything." Reynolds gripped the rubber blade and faced Emma across the training mat. His stance was aggressive, and Emma could see in his eyes that he wasn't planning to make this easy for her. "Ready?" Davis asked. Emma nodded, settling into a balanced stance that looked casual, but would allow her to move quickly in any direction. Reynolds came at her with more speed and aggression than the demonstration had shown. Instead of the controlled attack they had practiced, he drove forward with real intent, trying to overwhelm her with his size and strength. But Emma had been defending against knife attacks since she was 10 years old. Her grandmother had used everything from wooden training blades to actual kitchen knives, with the edges dulled to teach her proper respect for edged weapons. Reynolds' attack, though aggressive, was straightforward and predictable. Emma stepped offline from his attack, her hands moving with practiced precision. She caught his wrist, applied pressure to a specific nerve point that Gabriella had taught her, and used Reynolds' own momentum to send him stumbling past her. The training knife clattered to the ground. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. Reynolds spun around, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "You got lucky." "Good technique, Hayes," Davis observed. "Clean disarm, good footwork." He turned to Reynolds. "Remember that power without control is just wasted energy, Captain." They reset and tried again. This time Reynolds was even more aggressive, clearly frustrated by his first failure. But the result was the same. Emma's movements were efficient and precise, always seeming to be exactly where she needed to be at exactly the right time. After Reynolds' fourth failed attempt, Thompson stepped forward. Maybe I should try being the attacker now. No, Reynolds had said firmly. I'm not done. There was an ugly tone in his voice now that made several other trainees stop their own training to watch. Davis also noticed the change in atmosphere. Captain Reynolds, the purpose of this exercise is to learn not to dominate your training partner, Davis said with a warning in his tone. I understand that, Sergeant Bush, Reynolds replied, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. But I think Hayes might be getting overconfident. In real combat, her opponent won't be using training weapons. It was a thinly veiled threat, and everyone present understood it. Emma felt her pulse quicken slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. She had dealt with bullies before, and Reynolds was following a very predictable pattern. One more round, Davis decided, then we rotate. This time Reynolds didn't even pretend to follow the training protocol. He came at Emma with everything he had, trying to use his superior reach and weight to overpower her before she could react. Emma had been expecting this. Instead of using the defensive techniques they had been practicing, she fell back on what her grandmother had taught her about real knife fighting. She moved like water flowing around Reynolds' attack while her hands found the pressure points on his arm that would temporarily disable his grip. Reynolds found himself flat on his back with his own training weapon pressed against his throat. Emma's knee was on his chest, and her free hand was positioned where she could have struck several vital points if this had been a real fight. The silence that followed was deafening. Excellent control, Hayes, Davis said quietly, though his expression showed surprise. Though that last technique wasn't from our manual. Where did you learn that? Emma released Reynolds and helped him to his feet. My grandmother taught me some additional methods, Sergeant. Reynolds got up slowly, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. He said nothing, but the look he gave Emma promised that this wasn't over. Colonel Martinez, who had been observing silently, made a note in a small book he carried. His expression remained neutral, but there was a new interest in his eyes as he watched Emma return to her position. The rest of the day's training passed without further incident, but Emma could feel the shift in the group's dynamics. Word of what had happened at the knife defense station spread quickly through the recruits. Some were impressed, others were skeptical, and a few seemed almost hostile. During the evening meal, Emma sat with Anderson and a Navy corpsman named Rodriguez, who had become something like allies over the past 2 days. At the table across from them, Reynolds was holding court with 5 other Marines speaking in low, angry tones. You need to be careful, Rodriguez warned quietly. Reynolds has a reputation for holding grudges. He doesn't like being shown up, especially by someone he thinks should be beneath him. Anderson nodded in agreement. Some of these guys have never served with women in combat roles. They think the military is supposed to be their private boys' club. Emma took a bite of her food and considered their words. She had hoped to complete the training program without attracting too much attention, but it seemed that was no longer possible. I'm not looking for trouble, she said finally, but I won't back down if it finds me. Across the mess hall, Reynolds was still talking with his group, occasionally glancing in Emma's direction. One of his companions, a large Marine named Brooks, seemed particularly interested in whatever Reynolds was saying. I heard they're planning something, Rodriguez said under his breath. One of the guys in my barracks mentioned that Reynolds thinks you've been getting special treatment from the instructors. That's ridiculous, Anderson protested. If anything, they've been harder on her than on most of us. But Emma knew that facts wouldn't matter to someone like Reynolds. He had built his identity around being the strongest, the toughest, the most dominant person in any group. Her success challenged that identity in a way that he couldn't tolerate. As she prepared for bed that night, Emma thought about her grandmother's words about steel being forged in fire. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she had a feeling that Reynolds wasn't finished testing her yet. She pulled out her phone and typed a quick message to Gabriella. The fire is getting hotter, Lola, but I remember everything you taught me. The response came quickly. Good. Show them that a warrior doesn't break under pressure. Make your ancestors proud. Emma smiled and put the phone away. Whatever Reynolds and his friends were planning, she would be ready. On the third morning, the trainees gathered for what Davis announced would be a special evaluation exercise. Today we're going to conduct what we call the Circle Challenge, he explained. This tradition goes back to the early days of SEAL team training during the Cold War. One volunteer will stand in the center of a circle formed by the other trainees and will defend against a series of opponents entering the circle one at a time. His eyes swept across the group. This exercise separates the real fighters from the pretenders. The person in the center keeps fighting until they either defeat all challengers or get defeated themselves. Who wants to volunteer? Reynolds' hand shot up immediately. I'll do it, Sergeant. Davis nodded. All right, Captain Reynolds. Everyone else form a circle. Remember, this is still training, so we're looking for controlled contact and clean technique, not knockout punches. Reynolds moved to the center of the circle with obvious satisfaction. He had been waiting for an opportunity like this, a chance to reassert his dominance in front of the entire group. One by one, he faced the other trainees who entered the circle to challenge him. To his credit, Reynolds was a skilled fighter. He defeated Anderson cleanly, overwhelmed Rodriguez with superior strength, and outmaneuvered two other Army personnel. His confidence grew with each victory, and Emma could hear him making comments between matches. Come on, who's next? Don't tell me you're all scared now. Thompson entered the circle and gave Reynolds a real fight, but ultimately lost to a well-executed chokehold. By the time Reynolds had defeated his sixth opponent, he was breathing hard, but still standing strong. Anyone else want to try their luck? Reynolds called over, his eyes finding Emma in the circle. How about our resident expert Hayes? You've been awfully quiet today. Emma had been hoping to avoid this moment, but she realized that backing down now would only make the situation worse. The entire group was watching, waiting to see what she would do. If that's what the sergeant wants, she replied calmly. Davis looked between them, clearly sensing the underlying tension. This is about training, not personal issues. Both of you remember that. Emma nodded and stepped into the circle. Reynolds was still fresh enough to be dangerous, but she could see that his previous fights had taken some toll. More importantly, his victories had made him overconfident. They faced each other across the circle, and Emma could feel the weight of everyone's expectations. Some of the trainees were clearly hoping to see Reynolds put her in her place. Others, particularly Anderson and Rodriguez, were quietly rooting for her. Ready when you are, sweetheart, Reynolds said with a smirk. The fight began with Reynolds trying to use the same aggressive approach that had worked against his previous opponents. He was bigger, stronger, and more experienced in military combat training. What he didn't understand was that Emma had been preparing for opponents exactly like him her entire life. Gabriella had always told her that the biggest, strongest fighters were often the most predictable. They relied on their physical advantages and became frustrated when those advantages didn't immediately decide the fight. Emma let Reynolds come to her, absorbing his initial attack and using his momentum against him. When he tried to grab her for a takedown, she slipped his grip and used a technique from Kaylee to off-balance him. For the first 2 minutes, it looked like a fairly even match. Reynolds landed a few glancing blows, but nothing solid. Emma mostly stayed defensive, feeling out his patterns and waiting for the right opportunity. Then Reynolds made a mistake. Frustrated by his inability to land a decisive hit, he overextended on a powerful right hook. Emma ducked under the punch and moved to his side, where she applied a joint lock that Gabriella had taught her years ago. Reynolds found himself on the ground, tapping out to avoid injury to his shoulder. The circle was completely silent as Reynolds got back to his feet, his face dark with humiliation. Emma had expected him to shake hands and move on, but instead he turned to face Sergeant Davis. That didn't count, Reynolds announced. She used some kind of illegal hold. Davis frowned. The hold looking clean to me, Captain. With respect, Sergeant, I don't think you saw exactly what she did. That wasn't military combat technique. She's using some kind of street fighting. Several of Reynolds' friends in the circle began nodding in agreement. Brooks, the large Marine who had been listening to Reynolds' complaints all week, spoke up. Reynolds is right, Sergeant. If we're supposed to be learning military techniques, shouldn't we stick to military techniques? Emma felt the mood of the group shifting. Reynolds was trying to delegitimize her victory by claiming she had somehow cheated. It was a clever tactic that played on the uncertainty some of the recruits already felt about her unconventional background. The exercise was about effective fighting, not about limiting technique, Thompson interjected from the circle. Maybe against one opponent, Reynolds replied quickly. But this is supposed to be about real combat effectiveness. In a real fight, you might face multiple attackers. How do we know her exotic techniques would work against superior numbers? Emma realized where this was heading. Reynolds was maneuvering the conversation toward a scenario where he could stack the odds in his favor. Are you suggesting something specific? Captain Davis asked. Reynolds pretended to think about it, though Emma was sure he had planned this moment carefully. Well, Sergeant, if Hayes is as good as she thinks she is, maybe she should prove it against multiple opponents. Real Marines, not just one-on-one sparring. That's not how the exercise works, said Reynolds, Anderson called out from the circle. But Brooks and several other Marines began voicing their agreement with Reynolds' suggestion. They were calling it a test of real fighting ability, a way to see if Emma's techniques would work under realistic combat conditions. Davis held up his hand for silence. This is still a training exercise, not a free-for-all. If we're going to modify the format, there need to be rules and safety protocols. Of course, Sergeant, Reynolds said with false reasonableness. I'm not suggesting anything dangerous. Just maybe 2 or 3 opponents instead of one. See how well the Army's secret techniques work against multiple Marines. Emma could see the trap Reynolds was setting, but she also realized that declining the challenge would be seen as weakness by some of the group. Her reputation and credibility were at stake. How many opponents did you have in mind? She asked quietly. Reynolds' smile was predatory. How about 6 you against 6 Marines? Controlled contact. Same rules as before. Should be easy for someone with your special training. 6 opponents. It was clearly meant to be an impossible challenge designed to humiliate her in front of the entire group. Emma thought about her grandmother's words about steel being forged in fire. 6 sounds fair, she replied, her voice steady and calm. The circle erupted in surprised murmurs. Even Anderson and Rodriguez looked concerned. Taking on 6 opponents simultaneously was far beyond what anyone expected, even from the most skilled fighter. Davis studied Emma's face carefully. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Hayes. This isn't part of the official training. I understand, Sergeant, but if some people have questions about my abilities, maybe it's better to address them well. Reynolds' grin widened. He began pointing to Marines around the circle, selecting his team. Brooks was an obvious choice, along with 3 other large, experienced-looking Marines. The 6th was a wiry, fast-looking corporal named Davis, who specialized in close-quarters combat. As the 6 men moved to positions around the circle, Emma realized she was about to face the biggest challenge of her martial arts career. But somewhere deep inside, she could hear her grandmother's voice telling her that this was the moment she had been training for her entire life. Emma Hayes stood in the center of the circle, surrounded by 6 Marines who each outweighed her by at least 50 pounds. The training ground had gone completely silent, except for the sound of boots shifting on concrete and the distant call of seagulls from the Pacific. Master Sergeant Davis looked tense as he prepared to oversee what was either going to be an impressive demonstration or a complete disaster. His eyes met Emma's, briefly searching for any sign of doubt. Finding none, he nodded almost imperceptibly. Captain Michael Reynolds positioned himself directly in front of Emma, with Brooks and the other 4 Marines spacing themselves evenly around the circle's edge. They looked confident, almost casual, as if the outcome was already decided. Last chance to back out, Hayes, Reynolds called out, bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet. No shame in admitting when you're outmatched. Emma didn't respond verbally. Instead, she closed her eyes for just a moment and let her grandmother's training flow through her memory. Gabriella had taught her that fighting multiple opponents wasn't about matching their strength or speed. It was about timing, positioning, and using their numbers against them. The key Mija Gabriella had explained during one of their evening training sessions years ago is never to fight 6 people. You fight one person 6 times, but so quickly that the others cannot react. Emma opened her eyes and settled into a stance that none of the Marines recognized. It wasn't the rigid, powerful postures they had learned in their military training. Instead, she looked relaxed, almost casual, with her weight evenly distributed and her hands hanging loose at her sides. Fighters ready, Davis called out. The 6 Marines tensed, preparing to rush her simultaneously. Begin. What happened next would be talked about at Camp Pendleton for years afterward. Reynolds and Brooks charged straight at Emma from opposite sides, trying to overwhelm her with a coordinated attack. The other 4 Marines moved in more cautiously, planning to grab her once the first 2 had her engaged. But Emma didn't wait for them to reach her. Instead, she moved forward and slightly to her right, directly toward Brooks. Her sudden movement surprised him, as most people would have tried to back away from 6 attackers as not advance toward them. As Brooks reached for her, Emma dropped low and swept his legs with a technique called Seiko that her grandmother had shown her countless times. Brooks went down hard, and Emma used his falling body as a shield between herself and Reynolds' attack. Reynolds, unable to stop his momentum, collided with his own teammate. For just a moment, two of the six Marines were tangled up together on the ground. But Emma was already moving. She flowed like water between the remaining four Marines, never staying in one place long enough for them to coordinate an attack. When Corporal Davis tried to grab her from behind, she struck a pressure point on his wrist that made his hand go numb, then used his own forward momentum to send him stumbling into another Marine. The watching trainees were mesmerized. Emma's movements were unlike anything they had seen in their military training. She seemed to anticipate each attack before it happened, always positioning herself where she could deal with one opponent while using the other's positions against them. Master Sergeant Davis watched with growing amazement. In 30 years of military service, including time with SEAL Team 6, he had never seen anyone move quite like this. It reminded him of something he had witnessed once during a joint operation in the Philippines in the mid-1980s when an elderly local had taken down four armed insurgents in the blink of an eye. Corporal Mitchell, one of Reynolds' selected Marines, managed to get close enough to attempt a bear hug from behind. Emma felt him approaching and performed a technique Gabriella called gunting, a simultaneous strike and escape that left Mitchell grabbing empty air while she slipped to his side. Before Mitchell could recover, Emma applied brief pressure to a nerve cluster in his neck. It was a technique that would cause temporary disorientation without permanent damage, but Mitchell dropped to his knees, unable to maintain his balance. 3 down, 3 to go. Reynolds had untangled himself from Brooks and was back on his feet, angrier than ever. He came at Emma with everything he had, throwing punches with bad intentions. But Emma had been studying Reynolds' fighting patterns for days. She knew he telegraphed his attacks and relied too heavily on his reach advantage. She slipped inside his guard, using footwork that made her seem to disappear and reappear beside him. Before Reynolds could adjust, she struck 3 specific points on his torso in rapid succession. It was an advanced technique from the Filipino martial arts called limb destruction, targeting nerve clusters and pressure points to temporarily disable an opponent without causing lasting injury. Reynolds' right arm went numb, then his left leg gave out. He found himself sitting on the ground, completely unable to understand what had just happened to him. His face flushed red with a mixture of pain, confusion, and humiliation. The 5th Marine Sergeant Hayes had been hanging back, trying to analyze Emma's fighting style. He was the most experienced of the 6 and had realized that rushing in blindly would only get him defeated like the others. When Emma turned toward him, he was ready with a more cautious, technical approach. Hayes was a skilled boxer who had won several military competitions. He moved in with good footwork and crisp punches, trying to keep Emma at range, where his longer reach would be an advantage. But Gabriella had taught Emma to fight opponents exactly like Hayes. She used angles and timing to get inside his guard, then applied a technique called trapping hands that made it impossible for him to throw effective punches. Within seconds, Hayes found his own arms tied up and his balance compromised. A gentle push sent him to the ground, more confused than hurt. That left only Brooks, who had gotten back to his feet and was now approaching with much more caution than he had shown at the beginning. He had watched Emma defeat 5 Marines in less than 2 minutes, and he was beginning to understand that he was facing something far beyond ordinary military combat training. "What the hell are you?" Brooks asked, circling her slowly. Emma didn't answer. She could see the fear in his eyes now, the realization that everything he thought he knew about fighting had just been turned upside down. Brooks tried a wrestling approach, using his size and strength to get Emma to the ground, where he hoped to neutralize her speed and technique. But Emma had spent years learning how to fight larger, stronger opponents. She used his own weight and momentum against him, applying a technique that her grandmother had called flowing water. Brooks found himself airborne, flipping through the air before landing hard on his back. Emma had barely seemed to touch him, but somehow she had redirected all of his power and sent him flying. The entire training ground was dead silent. 6 Marines, all of them skilled fighters and experienced warriors, were sitting or lying on the ground around Emma. She stood in the center of the circle, breathing heavily, her uniform damp with sweat, looking calm but clearly feeling the physical toll of the encounter. A small cut had opened above her right eye, where she had caught an elbow, and she could feel the beginning of bruises forming on her arms and ribs. The whole encounter had taken less than 3 minutes. Sergeant Davis was the first to find his voice. "What in the hell was that, Lieutenant?" Emma looked around at the 6 defeated Marines, most of whom were staring at her with expressions of shock and disbelief. Reynolds was trying to get feeling back in his arm, while Brooks was still lying on his back, staring up at the sky. Filipino martial arts sergeant, Emma replied quietly. My grandmother taught me. The circle of watching trainees began to murmur among themselves. Some were asking questions about what they had just witnessed. Others were helping the defeated Marines back to their feet. Anderson was grinning from ear to ear. That was incredible, Hayes, he said. I've never seen anything like that. Rodriguez nodded in amazement. 6 against 1, and it wasn't even close. But Emma's attention was focused on Reynolds, who was finally managing to stand up. The expression on his face had changed completely. The arrogance and hostility were gone, replaced by something that might have been respect or possibly fear. How was all Reynolds managed to say? Emma looked at him for a long moment before responding. You assumed that because I was smaller and different, I must be weaker. But strength isn't just about size, and fighting isn't just about aggression. Davis stepped into the circle, his expression thoughtful. I think we all learned something important today about making assumptions. He turned to Emma. That was the most impressive display of martial arts I've seen in 20 years of military service, Lieutenant. But I'm curious why these techniques aren't part of our standard training if they're so effective. Emma wiped the blood from her eyebrow. They're not widely taught outside certain communities, Sergeant. My grandmother's family has passed down these techniques for generations. During World War II, her father was part of the Hukbalahap resistance against Japanese occupation. They worked with American forces, but they kept their fighting methods private. Davis nodded. I've heard stories. The Huks were some of the most effective guerrilla fighters in the Pacific Theater. They continued fighting during the communist insurgency afterward. He turned to address the entire group. This is exactly why this program exists, people. There are fighting systems and knowledge from around the world that we can learn from. No single tradition has all the answers. As the group began to disperse for the lunch break, Emma noticed that the entire dynamic had shifted. The trainees who had been watching her with suspicion or dismissiveness were now looking at her with genuine respect. Even some of Reynolds' closest friends were approaching her to ask questions about her training. But as she headed toward the mess hall, Emma felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Reynolds standing there, his face uncharacteristically uncertain. Lieutenant Hayes, he began, his voice quieter than usual. That was impressive. I've never seen anyone fight like that. Emma waited, sensing there was more. Reynolds struggled for words. Look, I was out of line. I let my ego get the better of me, and I put you in a potentially dangerous situation. That wasn't professional. No, it wasn't, Emma agreed, her tone neutral. I lost 2 of my best friends in Mogadishu. Reynolds continued, his eyes distant for a moment. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and some of the guys weren't prepared for that level of combat. Ever since then, I've been, I don't know, obsessed with making sure everyone around me is tough enough. I guess I thought that meant they had to be like me. Emma's expression softened slightly. Combat changes us all, Captain. I've lost people too. Reynolds nodded. Anyway, I wanted to say I was wrong about you. And I'm sorry. He extended his hand. After a brief hesitation, Emma took it. Fresh start, she asked. Fresh start, Reynolds agreed. As they entered the mess hall together, a subtle shift occurred in the group dynamics. The invisible lines that had divided the trainees began to blur and reorganize. Emma found herself sitting at a table with both Anderson and Rodriguez, but also with Brooks and 2 other Marines who had previously been firmly in Reynolds' camp. So these Filipino techniques, Brooks began, they actually work against multiple opponents. I always thought that was movie stuff. They do, Emma replied, but it takes years of training, and it's not about fighting 6 people at once. It's about positioning yourself so you're only fighting one at a time and using the other's positions and movements against them. Could you teach some of that? One of the other Marines asked. I could show you some basics, Emma said. But my grandmother would be a better teacher. She's been practicing since she was 5 years old. The conversation flowed easily through lunch, focusing on combat techniques and experiences rather than divisions or differences. Reynolds sat at another table, occasionally glancing over with an expression that mixed curiosity with something that might have been regret. After lunch, the trainees gathered for the afternoon session. Master Sergeant Davis stood at the front with Colonel Martinez, who had apparently been observing the morning's events with interest. This morning's demonstration, Davis began, provided a perfect introduction to this afternoon's topic, adaptive combat methods. The battlefield of the 21st century is not like anything we've trained for before. In Iraq and Afghanistan, you'll face enemies who don't fight conventionally. They use techniques and tactics that may be unfamiliar to you, often drawn from their own cultural traditions. When Colonel Martinez stepped forward, Lieutenant Hayes showed us something valuable today. Knowledge and skill can overcome physical advantages if applied correctly. This is particularly important as we develop specialized units for counterterrorism operations around the world. He scanned the group. The Advanced Military Arts Program was created specifically to identify and incorporate effective fighting methods from diverse traditions. Lieutenant Hayes, would you be willing to demonstrate some basic principles of the Filipino systems for the group? Emma was surprised but nodded her agreement. Yes, sir. For the next hour, Emma demonstrated fundamental concepts from Kali and Eskrima, focusing on footwork angles of attack and using an opponent's force against them. The trainees paired off to practice with Emma, moving among them to offer guidance and corrections. To her surprise, Reynolds approached her during a break in the practice. The way you redirected Brooks during the circle exercise, he said. Could you show me that again? Emma demonstrated the flowing water technique, slowly explaining the principles behind it. Reynolds attempted it several times, his forehead furrowed in concentration. It's counterintuitive, he muttered. My instinct is to resist force with force. That works when you're stronger, Emma replied. But when you're not, you need to be smarter about how you use energy. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. In Mogadishu, we were the stronger force, but we still lost people. Maybe if we'd been more adaptable. He trailed off, then attempted the technique again. This time his movement was smoother, more fluid. Better, Emma said. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the training group had transformed. The rigid hierarchy that had placed Reynolds at the table and viewed Emma with suspicion had given way to a more collaborative environment where everyone recognized they had something to learn. As the trainees prepared to leave the training ground, Davis approached Emma. A word, Lieutenant, he asked, gesturing for her to follow him to a quieter area. When they were alone, Davis spoke frankly. I've been reviewing your service record. There's an incident in Afghanistan that caught my attention. A Taliban ambush near Kandahar in 2002. Your squad was surrounded, but somehow you all made it out with minimal casualties. The details are redacted. Emma maintained a neutral expression. It was a difficult situation, Sergeant. I bet it was, Davis said. And I'm betting you used some of those techniques we saw today, didn't you? After a moment, Emma nodded. Yes. And the higher-ups classified it because they didn't understand what they were seeing, Davis concluded. Too many officers get nervous when confronted with things outside standard doctrine. Emma didn't confirm or deny this assessment. Davis continued. Colonel Martinez was impressed today. He's been pushing for expansion of this program, incorporating more diverse combat methods. He thinks you could be valuable to that effort. I'm just here to complete the training, Sergeant. Maybe, but consider this. How many lives could be saved if these techniques were more widely taught? How many soldiers might come home who otherwise wouldn't? The question lingered in Emma's mind as she returned to her quarters that evening. She called her grandmother again, this time using video. They know now, Emma told her in Tagalog, about the fighting arts. I had to show them today. Gabriella's weathered face showed concern even through the small phone screen. All of it. Not all, Emma assured her. Just enough. Her grandmother studied her for a moment. And how did they respond? Better than I expected. They want to learn. A slow smile spread across Gabriella's face. Perhaps it is time. For generations, our family kept these arts, secret teaching, only those we trusted. But the world changes, Mija. Perhaps now is the time for sharing, rather than hiding. Emma thought about Davis's words regarding the lives that might be saved. They've asked me to demonstrate more techniques tomorrow. Then teach them, Gabriella said firmly. But remember the responsibility that comes with knowledge. These are not just techniques for hurting people. They are about protection, about survival. I'll remember, Emma promised. After ending the call, Emma spent an hour in meditation, centering herself and preparing mentally for the days ahead. The path that had seemed so clear when she arrived at Camp Pendleton had suddenly developed new possibilities and complexities. The fourth day of training dawned with a sense of anticipation. The trainees gathered on the parade ground to find it had been rearranged with training mats covering a large area. Various practice weapons were arranged on racks nearby, including rattan sticks, similar to those Emma had trained with since childhood. Master Sergeant Davis stood at the front with Colonel Martinez and another man Emma didn't recognize. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, with the lean, weathered look of a career special operator. "Good morning," Davis began. "Today we're privileged to have General Robert Carter joining us. General Carter oversees Special Operations Training Development and has a particular interest in our program." The general nodded to the group. "I heard some interesting reports about yesterday's training. I decided to see for myself." Emma felt a flutter of nervousness. General Carter's reputation preceded him. He had been instrumental in modernizing special operations training across all branches of the military and was known for his no-nonsense approach to evaluating new methods. "Lieutenant Hayes," Colonel Martinez called out, "would you join us up front?" Emma stepped forward, maintaining a professional demeanor despite her surprise. Martinez turned to her. "General Carter would like to see a demonstration of the techniques you showed us yesterday. Would you be comfortable with that?" "Yes, sir," Imana replied. "Excellent. And we'll need a volunteer to assist." Martinez scanned the group. "Captain Reynolds." Reynolds seemed surprised but stepped forward. "Yes, sir." The dynamic between Emma and Reynolds had fundamentally changed since yesterday's circle challenge. The hostility was gone, replaced by a cautious respect. As they took positions on the training mat, Emma caught his eye. "Don't worry," she said quietly. "I'll go easy on you this time." Reynolds actually smiled. "Appreciate that, Lieutenant." For the next 30 minutes, Emma demonstrated basic Kelly techniques with Reynolds as her training partner. She showed the fundamental footwork patterns, hand positions, and defensive movements that form the foundation of the Filipino martial arts. Reynolds proved to be a quick study, adapting his movements to match her instructions with increasing fluidity. General Carter watched with intense focus, occasionally asking questions about specific techniques or principles. His expression remained neutral, giving no indication of his thoughts. After the demonstration, Carter approached Emma directly. "That was quite impressive, Lieutenant. How long have you been studying these methods?" "Since I was 6 years old, sir. My grandmother is a master of the Illustrissimo system." Carter nodded thoughtfully. "And yesterday you successfully employed these techniques against 6 opponents simultaneously." "Yes, sir." "Remarkable." Carter turned to Colonel Martinez. "This is exactly the kind of adaptive capability we need to be developing. The enemies we face today don't fight according to our rule book. We need warfighters who can adapt to unexpected situations and overcome superior numbers when necessary." He addressed the entire group. What Lieutenant Hayes demonstrated yesterday wasn't just impressive martial arts. It was a perfect example of the mindset we need to cultivate. Using an opponent's strengths against them, maintaining situational awareness under pressure, and adapting tactics to changing circumstances, these are the skills that save lives on today's battlefields. Carter returned his attention to Emma. "Lieutenant, I'd like you to work with Colonel Martinez after this training program concludes. We're developing specialized combat instruction for forward deployed units, and your expertise could be invaluable." Emma was stunned. "I'm honored, sir, but I'm not an instructor. I'm just a soldier who knows some different techniques." "Sometimes that's exactly what we need," Carter replied. "People who bring different perspectives to the table." He turned to Davis. "Carry on, Sergeant. I'll be observing for the remainder of the day." As Carter stepped back, Davis addressed the group. "Today we'll be working on adaptive response drills. The goal is to develop your ability to react effectively to unexpected attacks and situations. Lieutenant Hayes and Captain Reynolds will demonstrate first." For the rest of the morning, Emma and Reynolds worked together, showing the group various attack scenarios and appropriate responses. What had begun as antagonism between them had transformed into an effective teaching partnership, with Reynolds' conventional military training complementing Emma's more fluid approach. During the lunch break, Emma sat with Rodriguez Anderson and several other trainees who had become friendly over the past few days. The conversation flowed easily, ranging from combat experiences to hometowns and families. "So what's the deal with you and Reynolds now?" Rodriguez asked quietly. "Yesterday he wanted to humiliate you. Today you're teaching together like old friends." Emma shrugged. "Sometimes people just need their perspectives challenged. Reynolds is a good soldier. He just had some fixed ideas about what makes an effective fighter." "Well, you certainly challenged those ideas." Anderson laughed. "I've never seen anyone take down 6 opponents that efficiently." It wasn't as easy as it looked, Emma admitted, rubbing a particularly painful bruise on her ribs. I took some solid hits during that exchange. If it had gone on much longer, the outcome might have been different. This admission seemed to make the others more comfortable. No one liked the idea of an invincible superhuman in their midst, but a skilled fighter who could be hurt, just like anyone else, that was someone they could relate to. After lunch, the training shifted to weapons defense techniques. The trainees practiced with rubber training knives, batons, and simulated firearms, learning how to disarm opponents safely and effectively. Emma found herself partnered with Thompson, the Marine she had impressed during the first day's training. He had become one of her strongest supporters in the group. "You know, Hayes," Thompson said as they practiced knife disarms, "you've changed the whole dynamic of this course. Before you got here, it was just a bunch of guys trying to prove who was toughest. Now people are actually focused on learning." Emma deflected his practice attack and applied a control technique. "That wasn't my intention." "Maybe not, but it's what happened." Thompson reset his position. "Reynolds was the alpha dog and everyone just followed his lead. When you beat all 6 of them, it shook things up in a good way." The afternoon progressed with increasingly complex scenarios. Davis divided the trainees into teams for force-on-force exercises that required them to adapt to changing threats and conditions. Emma found herself leading one team with Reynolds heading the other. "Objective is simple," Davis explained. "Team 1 must reach the designated extraction point with their package intact. Team 2 will attempt to intercept and capture the package. Non-lethal training weapons only, and the exercise ends when the package is secured at the extraction point or captured by Team 2. The package was a sealed envelope containing training documents. Emma's team was tasked with protection and delivery. "What's the plan, Lieutenant?" asked a Marine named Garcia who had been assigned to Emma's team. Emma quickly assessed her team and the terrain they would be moving through. "We'll use deception rather than force. They'll be expecting us to take the most direct route to the extraction point, so we'll do the opposite." She outlined a circuitous approach that utilized terrain features for concealment. "We'll move in a loose formation, maintaining visual contact, but keeping enough distance between us that we don't present a single target. If we make contact with the opposition, we don't engage unless absolutely necessary. Our priority is the package, not winning firefights." Reynolds' team, positioned on the other side of the training area, was clearly planning a more aggressive approach. Emma could see them checking their training weapons and dividing into what appeared to be assault teams. When Davis signaled the start of the exercise, Emma's team moved out immediately, but not in the direction of the extraction point. Instead, they headed perpendicular to it, using a line of maintenance buildings for cover. "They're trying to flank us," Emma heard Reynolds tell his team over the radio, which Davis had left open so both teams could hear each other's communications. "Alpha team moved to intercept. Bravo hold position at the choke point." Emma smiled. Reynolds was reacting exactly as she had anticipated. "Change of plans," she told her team quietly. "We're going straight through the middle now." While Reynolds' team repositioned to counter a flanking maneuver that wasn't coming, Emma led her group directly through the center of the training area, moving quickly and quietly. They encountered only 2 members of Reynolds' team, who were caught off guard by the unexpected approach. Anderson, carrying the package, reached the extraction point without incident. The exercise was over in less than 15 minutes. Reynolds approached Emma afterwards, shaking his head with reluctant admiration. "You played me like a fiddle, Hayes. I was so busy trying to anticipate some clever martial arts tactic that I completely missed the actual strategy." "Sometimes the simplest approach is the most effective," Emma replied, "especially when your opponent is expecting something complex." Davis gathered the trainees for a debrief. What Lieutenant Hayes demonstrated there was strategic thinking. She used her knowledge of Captain Reynolds to predict his responses and then exploited them. In real combat situations, understanding your opponent's mindset can be as important as knowing their capabilities. As the training day concluded, General Carter approached Emma again. "Impressive work today, Lieutenant. Not just the martial arts, but the tactical thinking as well." "Thank you, sir. I've spoken with Colonel Martinez about your future assignment after this program. We believe your unique skill set could be valuable in our specialized training initiatives. Would you be interested in helping develop a curriculum that incorporates some of these adaptive combat methods?" Emma hesitated. "Sir, I've always seen myself as a field officer, not an instructor." Carter nodded. I understand that, but consider this. How many lives might be saved if these techniques were taught more widely? How many soldiers might come home to their families because they had the skills to adapt and overcome in critical situations? It was almost the same question Davis had posed the previous day, and it resonated deeply with Emma. She thought of her father, of the risks he had taken throughout his career, and of the comrades she had lost in Afghanistan. What if they had known some of the techniques her grandmother had taught her? I'll consider it, sir. Good. We'll talk more after the program concludes. Carter shook her hand. Your grandmother must be a remarkable woman, Lieutenant. I hope I have the opportunity to meet her someday. As Emma returned to her quarters that evening, she found a small group of trainees waiting for her, including Anderson, Rodriguez Thompson, and surprisingly Brooks. A few of us were wondering if you'd be willing to show us some more of those Filipino techniques, Thompson said. Just the basics. Davis approved it as optional evening training. Emma was touched by the request. Of course, let me change and I'll meet you at the training area in 15 minutes. When she arrived at the designated space, she was surprised to find not just the four who had asked, but nearly half the class, including Reynolds. Word spread, Anderson explained with a grin. Emma spent the next hour showing them fundamental Kali movements, focusing on the core principles rather than specific techniques. The trainees practiced in pairs, their faces concentrated as they attempted to master the unfamiliar motions. Reynolds approached her as the session wound down. I've been thinking about what happened yesterday, he said quietly. The way you handled all six of us. What about it? In Mogadishu, we were outnumbered and surrounded. I lost my two best friends because we couldn't adapt fast enough to the situation. We were trained to fight conventionally, but there was nothing conventional about that day. His eyes were distant with memory. If we'd known some of what you showed us today, maybe things would have been different. Emma understood then that Reynolds' aggressive posturing had been covering something deeper. The guilt and pain of loss and the desperate need to ensure no one else experienced what he had. It's not too late to learn, she said simply. Reynolds nodded. No, I guess it's not. As the impromptu training session broke up, Emma noticed Davis watching from the doorway. He nodded to her with approval before disappearing back into the night. That evening, Emma called her grandmother again. Things have changed, Lola, she explained. They want me to help develop a training program based on our fighting arts. Gabriella was silent for a long moment. And what do you want me, huh? Emma considered the question carefully. I want to serve to make a difference. If teaching these techniques can save lives, isn't that a form of service? Her grandmother smiled gently. Our arts were kept secret for generations because they needed to be. The Spanish colonizers, the Japanese occupiers, they would have used our knowledge against us. But perhaps now is the time for openness. Perhaps now our traditions can serve a greater purpose. You wouldn't mind me sharing what you've taught me? Knowledge is like water, mija, Gabriella replied. If it doesn't flow, it becomes stagnant. Just remember to teach not just the techniques, but the wisdom behind them. These are not just ways to hurt people, but ways to protect, to serve, to overcome. Emma nodded. I'll remember. As she prepared for bed, Emma reflected on how dramatically the situation had changed in just a few days. She had arrived at Camp Pendleton expecting to enhance her own combat skills, but instead found herself in a position to potentially transform how the military approached close-quarters combat training. What had begun as a test of her abilities had become something far more significant, a bridge between traditions, an opportunity to share knowledge that could save lives. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time since Afghanistan, Emma felt a sense of clear purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she would face them with the wisdom of her grandmother and the strength of her training. The fire had indeed been hot, but as Gabriella had predicted, the steel of Emma's character had been tempered, rather than broken by the experience. Dawn broke over Camp Pendleton's coastal mountains, painting the training grounds in shades of gold and amber. The fifth day of the Advanced Military Arts program promised to be the most challenging yet. Emma Hayes arrived early, finding Master Sergeant Davis already setting up equipment for the day's exercises. Morning, Lieutenant, Davis nodded, arranging a series of training dummies in a complex pattern. Sleep well. Well enough, Emma replied, though the truth was more complicated. She'd spent half the night considering General Carter's proposal and what it might mean for her future. The other half had been devoted to crafting a lesson plan for today's demonstration at Colonel Martinez's request. "Big day ahead," Davis said, checking his watch. "General Carter will be back with some other brass. Word of your performance has traveled fast." Emma felt a flutter of nerves, wasn't expecting quite this much attention. Davis paused his work, fixing her with a steady gaze. "That's what happens when you change the game, Lieutenant. People notice." The trainees began arriving in groups, the dynamics notably different from just days ago. Where once there had been clear divisions with Reynolds at the top of a rigid hierarchy, now there were mixed groups engaged in animated discussions. Several nodded respectfully to Emma as they passed. Reynolds arrived last, walking directly to Emma with purpose in his stride. "Morning, Hayes," he said, his demeanor professional but relaxed. "Been thinking about that flowing water technique you showed yesterday. Mind if I run something by you before the session starts?" "Not at all," Emma replied, surprised but pleased by the request. Reynolds demonstrated a modified version of the technique, incorporating elements of his Ranger combat training. "I figured the principle could work with different entry points," he explained, moving through the sequence slowly. Emma watched with genuine interest. "That's actually quite good. You're adapting it to your own body mechanics, which is exactly how it should work." A slight smile crossed Reynolds' face. "Turns out I can learn new tricks after all." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Martinez, General Carter, and three other high-ranking officers Emma didn't recognize. The trainees quickly assembled in formation. "Good morning," Martinez began. "Today's session will focus on practical applications of adaptive combat methods in current operational environments. Lieutenant Hayes will lead the first demonstration, followed by force-on-force exercises, incorporating the techniques you've been learning." He gestured to the visitors. "Joining General Carter today are Colonel Wilson from Special Operations Command, Major General Thompson from Training and Doctrine Command, and Captain Richards from Naval Special Warfare." Emma felt the weight of expectations settle on her shoulders. These weren't just any officers, they represented the elite training establishments across multiple branches of service. General Carter stepped forward. "Before we begin, I want to emphasize something. What you're learning here isn't just about hand-to-hand combat techniques. It's about adaptive thinking, the ability to overcome superior force through intelligence positioning and leveraging your opponent's energy against them. These principles apply across all aspects of modern warfare, from small unit tactics to strategic planning." He nodded to Emma. "Lieutenant Hayes, you have the floor." Emma moved to the center of the training area, taking a moment to center herself. "This morning, I'd like to demonstrate how the principles of Filipino martial arts can be applied to various combat scenarios we might encounter in current operational environments." She gestured to Reynolds. "Captain Reynolds has volunteered to assist me. We'll begin with multiple opponent scenarios in confined spaces, similar to room-clearing operations in urban environments." For the next 30 minutes, Emma and Reynolds demonstrated techniques for dealing with multiple attackers in tight quarters. They showed how traditional military methods could be enhanced with concepts from Cayley and Eskrima, controlling angles of approach, creating barriers with available ematics, and using an opponent's momentum to create openings for counterattacks. The visiting officers watched with intense interest, occasionally conferring among themselves. Major General Thompson, in particular, seemed captivated by the demonstrations, his eyes narrowed in concentration as he studied Emma's movements. "Now," Emma continued, "we'll demonstrate applications with standard issue equipment." She and Reynolds donned tactical gear, plate carriers' helmets, and weapon rigs loaded with training equipment. The added weight and restricted movement created new challenges, but Emma showed how the principles could be adapted to accommodate these limitations. "The key," she explained, "is understanding that these techniques aren't rigid forms to be memorized. They're principles to be internalized and applied according to the situation. Adaptability is the core concept." As the demonstration concluded, the trainees broke into enthusiastic applause. Even the visiting officers seemed impressed, with General Carter nodding in apparent approval. "Excellent work, Lieutenant," Martinez said. "Now we'll move to practical exercises. Captain Reynolds will command Blue Force. Lieutenant Hayes will lead Red Force. Objective is to clear and secure the mock village complex while maintaining force integrity." The training area included a small urban warfare simulation site, a collection of concrete structures designed to mimic buildings in Middle Eastern or Central Asian settings. The complex challenge would test not just individual skills, but also unit cohesion and tactical thinking. Rules of engagement that are simple, Davis announced. Non-lethal training weapons only. If you're hit in a limb, that limb is disabled. Torso or head hits mean you're out. Your objective is to secure the central building while minimizing casualties. Emma gathered her team, Anderson Rodriguez Thompson, and 4 others who had shown particular interest in her teaching methods. Reynolds' team consisted of Brooks Davis Mitchell and 4 Marines who specialized in urban warfare. They have the advantage in this environment, Emma told her team as they prepared. They've trained specifically for urban combat, and they know the standard approaches. So what's our play? Anderson asked. Emma smiled. We don't use the standard approaches. Here's what we're going to do. The exercise began with a sharp whistle from Sergeant Davis. Reynolds' team moved quickly to establish defensive positions around the central objective, clearly expecting Emma's force to approach along the main avenues of the mock village. Instead, Emma split her team into pairs, each taking indirect routes through the complex. They moved quietly using the principles of angular displacement she had taught them to minimize exposure while maintaining situational awareness. From his observation position, General Carter watched with growing interest. She's applying the same principles from hand-to-hand combat to small unit tactics, he remarked to Colonel Martinez. Fascinating approach. Reynolds' team had prepared for a frontal assault, positioning their strongest fighters to cover the most likely approaches. When no attack materialized, confusion set in. Where the hell are they? Brooks muttered over the team radio. Reynolds, more familiar now with Emma's thinking, realized the danger too late. They're coming from multiple angles. Reposition now. But Emma's team had already infiltrated the defensive perimeter. Using the flowing movement principles of Kali, they approached from blind spots, eliminated isolated defenders, and created chaos in the organized defense. Thompson and Rodriguez reached the central objective, first securing the primary entrance, while the rest of Emma's team systematically neutralized the remaining defenders. Reynolds, recognizing the inevitable outcome, attempted a counterattack with his remaining forces, but found himself outmaneuvered by Emma's adaptive positioning. The exercise ended with Emma's team in full control of the objective, having eliminated 6 of Reynolds' 8-person team while losing only 2 of their own. Exercise complete, Davis called. Red Force victory. The trainees regrouped for debrief, removing their simulation equipment and comparing notes on the experience. Reynolds approached Emma with a thoughtful expression. You applied the same principles to squad tactics that you used against the 6 of us in the circle, he observed. Never engaging directly where we were strongest, always moving to create advantageous positions. Emma nodded. The concepts scale up from individual combat to unit tactics. It's all about energy management and positional awareness. I've been doing this wrong for years, Reynolds admitted. Always focusing on overwhelming force rather than smart positioning. He extended his hand. Good match, Lieutenant. As they shook hands, Emma noticed General Carter approaching with the other visiting officers. Impressive display, Lieutenant Hayes, Carter said. You've taken principles from a traditional combat system and applied them to modern tactical scenarios with remarkable effectiveness. Major General Thompson, a tall, austere man with decades of combat experience etched into his face, spoke next. I've overseen training development for 23 years, Lieutenant. In all that time, I've rarely seen someone bridge the gap between traditional martial arts and contemporary military applications so seamlessly. Emma maintained her professional composure despite the unexpected praise. Thank you, sir. The credit belongs to my grandmother and the generations before her who preserved and refined these methods. Perhaps, Thompson replied, but the innovation and application is yours. He turned to Martinez. The program proposal you submitted makes more sense now that I've seen it in action. You have my support. Captain Richards, the Naval Special Warfare representative, had been quietly observing throughout the day. Now he addressed Emma directly. My team has been developing specialized close-quarters battle protocols for maritime interdiction operations. The approaches you demonstrated today could be valuable additions to our methodology. Emma felt slightly overwhelmed by the attention but maintained her focus. I'd be happy to contribute in any way I can, sir. General Carter turned to address all the trainees. What you've witnessed and participated in these past days represents the future of adaptive combat training. The threats we face are evolving rapidly, and our methods must evolve with them. Traditional systems like the Filipino martial arts, Lieutenant Hayes has demonstrated contain centuries of battle-tested wisdom that we would be foolish to ignore. He returned his attention to Emma. Lieutenant, I'd like you to report to Fort Bragg after completing this program. Colonel Wilson will be your point of contact. We're establishing a specialized training cell to develop these concepts further with potential application across all branches. Emma's mind raced with the implications. Fort Bragg was the home of Special Operations Command, the heart of America's most elite fighting forces. Such an assignment would mean a significant shift in her career trajectory. I'm honored by the opportunity, sir, she replied carefully, but I should mention that I'm not the most qualified instructor for these methods. My grandmother. We're aware of Gabriela Santos's expertise, Carter interrupted with a knowing smile. Colonel Martinez has already extended an invitation for her to consult on the program development should you accept the assignment. Emma couldn't hide her surprise. You've spoken with my grandmother. Yesterday evening, Martinez confirmed. She's a remarkable woman, Lieutenant. Her insights will be invaluable. The day's formal training concluded with additional force-on-force exercises, each team incorporating elements of what they'd learned from Emma's demonstrations. The improvement in performance was immediately evident, with more fluid movement, better positional awareness, and increased tactical creativity across all the training teams. As the trainees dispersed for the evening meal, Emma found herself surrounded by colleagues eager to discuss specific techniques and applications. The transformation from outsider to respected instructor had occurred with breathtaking speed. Later that evening, Emma sat alone in her quarters contemplating the dramatic shift in her circumstances. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Got a minute, Hayes? Reynolds asked when she opened the door. Emma nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. Reynolds remained standing in his posture, betraying unusual hesitation. I wanted to speak with you privately before making any decisions about tomorrow's training. What's on your mind, Captain? Reynolds took a deep breath. I owe you a more complete apology than I've given. When you first arrived, I made assumptions based on nothing but prejudice. I saw your size, your gender, and decided you didn't belong here without giving you a chance to prove yourself. He looked directly at her now. Worse, I deliberately put you in danger with that 6-person challenge. It was unprofessional and unworthy of the uniform I wear. Emma appreciated his candor. What changed your perspective? Getting my ass handed to me by someone half my size was a good start, Reynolds admitted with a rueful smile. But it was more than that. Watching you teach, seeing how you approach problems, it made me question a lot of things I thought I knew. He paused, gathering his thoughts. In Somalia, we were outnumbered and surrounded. I lost my 2 best friends because we couldn't adapt fast enough to changing circumstances. Ever since then, I've been fixated on physical strength and aggression as the answer to every tactical problem. It's a natural response to trauma, Emma said quietly. Reynolds nodded. Maybe so, but it made me rigid in my thinking, and that's dangerous in our line of work. He straightened his shoulders. Anyway, I wanted you to know that I've recommended to General Carter that you be given a permanent position in the training development program. Emma was genuinely surprised. You did your methods work, Hayes. They could save lives, maybe lives like my friends in Mogadishu. His expression was solemn. In our business, that's what matters more than ego or tradition. After Reynolds left, Emma called her grandmother. When Gabriela's face appeared on the screen, Emma switched to Tagalog. Is it true you spoke with Colonel Martinez? Gabriela's weathered face creased in a smile. Yes, he was very respectful, very interested in our family's traditions. They want me to help develop a training program at Fort Bragg, Emma explained. They've invited you to consult as well. I know, Gabriela replied. I told the colonel I would be honored to contribute, but only if you felt it was the right path for you. Emma hesitated. I'm not sure, Lola. I always saw myself in the field not as an instructor. All paths of service have value, Mija, her grandmother said gently. Sometimes the greatest impact comes from teaching others. Think of how many lives might be saved if these methods were more widely known. That's what General Carter said, Emma acknowledged. He sounds like a wise man. Gabriela studied her granddaughter's face through the screen. What is truly holding you back? Emma considered the question carefully. Our family has guarded these techniques for generations. Is it right for me to share them so widely? Gabriela's expression grew thoughtful. When my father taught me these arts, it was a time of occupation and danger. Secrecy was necessary for survival, but times change and wisdom must adapt to new circumstances. She leaned closer to the camera. These methods were developed to protect the vulnerable against those with greater power. If they can serve that purpose for American soldiers facing overwhelming odds, isn't that honoring their original intent? The next morning, the final day of the program began with a formal assessment exercise. Each trainee would demonstrate mastery of the techniques they had learned throughout the course. Emma performed her assessment flawlessly, incorporating both traditional military methods and the adaptive techniques she had introduced to the program. The evaluating officers watched with approval, making notes on their tablets as she moved through each scenario with fluid precision. Reynolds performed equally well, showing remarkable progress in integrating the Filipino concepts into his established combat style. The transformation in his approach was evident to everyone watching. After the assessments concluded, Colonel Martinez addressed the assembled trainees. "You've all performed admirably during this course," he began. "What started as an experimental program has evolved into something far more significant. Thanks in large part to Lieutenant Hayes's contributions, we're now developing an entirely new approach to adaptive combat training." He gestured to Emma. "Lieutenant Hayes has agreed to accept a special assignment at Fort Bragg, where she'll help develop a comprehensive training curriculum based on the principles you've experienced these past days." A spontaneous round of applause broke out among the trainees. Emma felt a surge of emotion at this unexpected show of support from her peers. Additionally, Martinez continued, "Captain Reynolds will be joining the development team, bringing his extensive field experience and tactical knowledge to ensure the new methods integrate effectively with existing protocols." Reynolds, standing nearby, gave Emma a nod of professional respect. Their journey from adversaries to colleagues had been remarkable, a transformation neither could have anticipated when the program began. As the formal ceremony concluded, the trainees gathered to exchange contact information and final thoughts before departing to their respective assignments. Anderson approached Emma with Rodriguez close behind. "So, Fort Bragg," Anderson said, "Special Operations Training Development. That's quite a step up from regular field assignments." Emma smiled. "It wasn't what I expected when I arrived here." Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. "1 week ago, Reynolds was trying to run you out of the program. Now you're both headed to develop cutting-edge training methods for Special Operations Command. Funny how things work out." "Life rarely follows the path we expect," Emma replied. Later that afternoon, as the trainees began departing Camp Pendleton, Emma found herself standing alone at the edge of the training ground where it had all begun. The sun was setting over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the concrete expanse where she had faced 6 opponents just days earlier. "Quite a view," came General Carter's voice from behind her. Emma turned to find the general approaching, his formal demeanor slightly relaxed now that the official proceedings had concluded. "Yes, sir," she agreed. "California has its charms." Carter stood beside her, gazing out at the ocean. "Your grandmother arrived at Fort Bragg this morning, remarkable woman. She's already offering suggestions for the facility setup." Emma couldn't help smiling at the thought. She doesn't waste time. "A family trait, it seems." Carter turned to face her directly. "I want you to understand the significance of what you've accomplished here, Lieutenant. Military doctrine tends to evolve at a glacial pace, resistant to outside influence. What you've managed to do, introducing ancient Filipino concepts into modern special operations training, represents a paradigm shift that could save countless lives." "I just shared what I knew, sir." "With courage and conviction against significant resistance," Carter corrected her. "That's the kind of leadership we need, people willing to challenge established thinking when better methods exist." He extended his hand. "Your flight to Fort Bragg leaves tomorrow morning. Colonel Wilson will meet you upon arrival. I look forward to seeing what you and your grandmother develop." 6 months later, Emma stood in a state-of-the-art training facility at Fort Bragg, watching as a class of Special Forces candidates moved through drills that combined traditional military techniques with the adaptive principles of Kali and Eskrima. The integration was seamless now, refined through months of development and testing. Reynolds entered the observation room carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Emma before joining her at the window. "Assessment team just submitted their report," he said. "The units trained in the new protocols are showing a 30% improvement in close quarters effectiveness compared to conventional methods." Emma nodded, sipping her coffee. "The real test will come in actual deployment situations." Early indications are promising. That SEAL team that rotated through last month used some of our techniques during a hostage extradition in Somalia. Commander said it was the difference between success and failure when they were outnumbered 3-1. A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the trainees below. The journey from antagonists to colleagues to friends had been unexpected, but rewarding for both of them. Your grandmother's session with the Delta Force instructors yesterday was something to see, Reynolds remarked. 93 years old and still dropping operators half her age. Emma smiled. Gabriella had flourished in her role as senior consultant to the program, her lifetime of knowledge finding new purpose and appreciation among America's elite warriors. She always said these arts weren't meant to stay hidden forever, Emma reflected, that someday they would serve a greater purpose. The training session below concluded and the candidates gathered around their instructor, a compact, intense Korean-American woman named Kim. She had been one of the first female operators to complete the new adaptive combat program, showing a natural affinity for the Filipino methods that reminded Emma of herself. Lieutenant Kim has really taken to the program, Reynolds observed. Reminds me of someone else I know. Emma nodded. She faced the same skepticism I did at first. Some of the male candidates didn't think someone her size could be effective in combat situations. Until she put 5 of them on the ground in under 2 minutes, Reynolds finished with a chuckle. History repeats itself. A young aide appeared at the door. Major Hayes General Carter has arrived for the demonstration. Emma straightened her uniform. In the months since Camp Pendleton, her promotion had come through, along with formal recognition of her contributions to military training development. Shall we? She asked Reynolds, who now wore the oak leaves of a major as well. As they walked toward the main demonstration area, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her here. What had begun as a personal challenge had evolved into something far more significant, a bridge between traditions, a melding of ancient wisdom with modern warfare requirements. In the large training hall, General Carter waited with a delegation of foreign military observers. Emma recognized uniforms from Britain, Australia, Israel, and several NATO countries. Major Hayes and Carter greeted her. Our international partners are eager to see the program you've developed. I've been telling them how you single-handedly changed our approach to close-quarters combat training. Emma smiled diplomatically. Hardly single-handed, sir. It's been a team effort from the beginning. As the demonstration began, Emma watched with pride as instructors showcased the integrated system that had emerged from her grandmother's traditional teachings and modern military requirements. The fluid movements, adaptive positioning, and energy-efficient techniques had been refined into a comprehensive methodology that could be taught to operators of any size or gender. Afterward, as the observers discussed what they'd seen, Emma found a quiet moment alone with Carter. Your father would be proud, he said unexpectedly. Emma looked at him in surprise. You knew my father? Carter nodded. James Hayes and I served together in Desert Storm. He was one of the finest operators I ever knew. Adaptable, innovative, always thinking beyond conventional approaches. He smiled slightly. Seems the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Before Emma could respond, she noticed her grandmother entering the hall, accompanied by Reynolds. Despite her age, Gabriella moved with the fluid grace of a lifetime martial artist, her small figure commanding instant respect from the hardened warriors around her. There she is, Emma said with affection. The real force behind all of this. Carter watched as the international observers gravitated toward Gabriella, clearly recognizing the wisdom she embodied. Sometimes the most powerful influences come from unexpected sources, he observed. A lesson your grandmother taught you well, and one you've now taught all of us. As Emma moved to join her grandmother, she caught sight of Lieutenant Kim speaking with a group of new female candidates who had just arrived for training. The women were watching the demonstrations with a mixture of awe and uncertainty, clearly wondering if they could master such techniques. Kim caught Emma's eye and nodded in understanding. The cycle was continuing, knowledge passing from one generation to the next, barriers being broken and traditions evolving to meet new challenges. In that moment, Emma fully understood what her grandmother had meant about knowledge being like water. It needed to flow freely to remain vital, adapting to new landscapes while maintaining its essential nature. What had begun at Camp Pendleton with one woman facing 6 doubters had grown into something that would influence military training for decades to come. The journey hadn't been easy, but as Gabriella had taught her from childhood, the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. Emma Hayes' daughter, granddaughter, soldier, and now teacher, had found her true path of service, not just as a warrior herself, but as one who empowers warriors of all kinds to adapt, overcome, and return home safely to those who love them. As she watched the next generation of trainees beginning their journey, Emma felt the weight of responsibility balanced by the satisfaction of purpose fulfilled. The ancient wisdom of her ancestors now served a new mission, protecting those who protect others in a world of ever-changing threats. The circle was complete, and yet the journey continued, just as it should be.